Our next speaker is Paul Williams from MSD Animal Health, Milton Keynes in the UK. Paul's going to talk to us about a very important issue. It's often neglected because we keep getting asked questions about how should we store vaccines and what happens if they're stored in the wrong conditions, are they going to work or not going to work. So I'm looking forward to this talk by Paul today. Thank you, Paul.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think we all recognise that vaccines are really important tools to help us control infectious diseases in livestock. And during the research and development phase, the potency of vaccines is determined by clinical studies. And it's really important during the vaccine shelf life that they're stored correctly, right through from when they leave manufacturing up until the time they're administered to the animals. Because if they're not stored correctly, then we could actually reduce that potency or actually end up inactivating the vaccine entirely. And I think if we look at the vaccines that we typically use in the EU in livestock, they tend to fall into two categories. They are either live vaccines or inactivated adjuvanted vaccines. And the majority of vaccines, their temperature storage requirements, that they need to be kept between 2 and 8 degrees centigrade. Now, I think whilst it's well recognised that live vaccines are perhaps a bit more sensitive to elevation in temperature, and that's why we tend to think about the vaccine cool chain. Perhaps what's not quite so well recognised is that whilst inactivated adjuvanted vaccines are perhaps a bit more stable in slight rises in temperature, they can be very sensitive to freezing, especially those containing alum. And if we look at the structure of these inactivated vaccines, we have the alum and we have the antigen, and they're bound together in a lattice, and that structure is required to get the immune response. And if we freeze the vaccine, then we break that lattice apart, and thawing the vaccine doesn't actually get it to come back together. And that picture there is just a test that they commonly use in human medicine. It's called the shake test to compare the sediment rates, and that can determine whether an activated vaccine actually has been frozen or not. So, like I said, monitoring and getting the correct storage is really very, very important for vaccines. And certainly in the UK, it is not uncommon for vaccine to be stored on farm prior to administration. And I appreciate this isn't done in all European countries. It is, again, a practice that is undertaken in others. So the objective of this study was actually just to record the performance of some vaccine fridges on farm and how good they were actually maintaining these temperature requirements. So the study was done in 2014, between January and August, so hopefully a good range of environmental temperatures exposure. It was actually done on 19 farms, but only had data available from 17 farms. On each farm, we put three data loggers in place. So one data logger was placed outside of the fridge, but sort of in the vicinity of the fridge, and 2 data loggers were placed actually inside the fridge, one towards the top of the fridge and the other one towards the bottom. And these loggers were set to record the temperature every 30 minutes. So why every 30 minutes? Well, the suppliers of these data loggers do a lot of work in human medicine, and what they said that it typically takes a vaccine in its normal packaging contents has to be exposed to a temperature for 20 minutes before the vaccine actually equilibrates with that temperature, and that's why we chose the 30 minutes. And when we analysed the data, we looked at the individual temperature recordings, but we also wanted to try and get an indication of the severity. So what we looked at was creating what we called an event. An event was basically where 2 continuous recordings were the same. So, for example, if I took a recording 1, and that was 12 degrees centigrade, and the next recording was also, say, 11 degrees centigrade, then that became an event, and that would be an above 8 degrees centigrade event. And clearly the duration of the event was dependent on the number of those subsequent recordings. So if we look at some of the background of the farm, I appreciate at Buiatrics we're predominantly only interested in cattle, but for the sake of completeness, there were some sheep-only farms and some pig farms, which I've included. It's quite interesting looking at fridge age. I think if you look there, we can see that most of these fridges on these farms were quite old. And when you went back and talked to these farmers why that might be the case, or when they rushed out to buy a new fridge, the new fridge went into the house and the old fridge came out to actually store the vaccines. And actually how they use the fridges, you can see that very few of the farms actually use the fridges just solely for storing vaccine. A lot of them use them to store other medicines or maybe storing colostrum. And if we looked at the beef, sheep, and the sheep-only farms, they normally stored their vaccine actually in the household fridge. Now, both of these two latter things, the fact that we've got other things being stored, does mean that the vaccine fridge is going to be opened on a much more frequent basis than what we would want. So just some pictures there of some typical fridges from the study. And the one on the left here is actually one of the better fridges in the study. You can actually see that they're not just being used for vaccines, there's some other medicines, but perhaps you can get appreciation that although the fridge itself is quite good, it may not be in the best location. It's got a lot of stuff around it, so maybe the airflow, etc. The one in the middle is one of the older fridges that I saw. And what we see with this fridge as well as having a fridge, it has a ice compartment or freezing compartment at the top. And really, we don't want that in vaccines that don't want to be frozen. We just want a fridge that just has the refrigerator compartment, not the freezing box. And the last one is one of the domestic fridges, and I think I must have just happened to visit them on the day they did the household shop, because somewhere within that there were actually some vaccines, but you can see there's also a lot of food storage as well. Just so this actually, thankfully, I'd like to think this is not a typical fridge. A farmer found out about this study. This isn't a fridge from the study. He found out about the study. Calf rearer. This was rearing around about 300 to 500 calves a year coming through this farm. Heard about the study. He was a bit worried about his fridge. Asked me to come and have a look at it. Unsurprisingly, there was vaccine in that fridge, which was actually frozen. So I'm just going to show you some of the graphs from each of the individual farms. So on the x-axis, we have time, as in months, and the y-axis is the temperature in degrees centigrade. The two red lines show the 8 and 2 degrees range, and the yellow colour is the data logger that's outside of the fridge, the external, and the blue and green are the two internal data loggers. And you can see for each colour there's a shaded area and a solid line. The shaded area is the individual temperature recordings, and the solid line is an approximate moving daily average. And this is actually one of our better fridges from the study. And you can see that throughout the study, although some of the individual temperature recordings do go outside of the 8 and 2 degrees range, overall it's not doing too badly. This fridge wasn't doing too badly till towards the latter part of the study, when there was a power interruption over several days. And when we went back to the farmer of this fridge, they weren't aware why that had actually occurred. They had no explanation for why that might have happened. But clearly, there was a risk if there had been vaccines in that fridge at that time. This is a picture that we saw in many of the fridges, so that though earlier in the study they actually performed relatively well, as the external environmental temperature increased during the summer months, then also the internal temperature of the fridge also increased. And this is probably just due to results of the age of the fridge, how the fridge has been maintained, the door seals, etc., not being replaced or functioning correctly. If we go to the other extreme, this is a fridge. It's not a fridge, it's basically a freezer. And you can see that predominantly throughout of the study, we've got really, really low temperatures. This fridge was actually being used to store beer as well as vaccines. So clearly the farmer was very interested in keeping his beer cold, but not really too worried about his vaccine. And when is a fridge not a fridge? This is worrying. This was a large dairy unit, 600 cows. I turned up on the farm and I said, I'm a bit worried that this fridge feels a bit warm. We checked the plug, it was plugged in. Farmer said, don't worry, I'll get it sorted. I went back in September, and that was the result of him getting it sorted, which was no change. Both times when I visited this farm, there was live vaccine being stored in this fridge. The other thing that we tried to do is, see, farmers buy vaccine and they might only store it for a few days before they use it. So we just try to get an indication of risk. What was the risk of a vaccine going into a poor environment? So what we did on a monthly basis for each fridge is we totaled up all of the events, added them all together to get the total minutes, and then compared that to the total minutes available in that month and expressed that as a percentage. And what I've just used is an arbitrary cutoff, just arbitrary. I've said, well, where was, on a monthly basis, where was the fridge spending 50% of its time above 8 degrees centigrade? And you can see if we look at that top line, farm number 9, from May onwards, this fridge was spending all of its time above 8 degrees centigrade. And what we saw in the summer months, it wasn't just the fact that they spent more of their time above 8 degrees centigrade. Actually, the temperature above 8 degrees centigrade also increased. So if you like, the severity of the events were increasing. Again, just looking at freezing, the same approach, but maybe not so important at time exposure. We just had, is there an opportunity for a vaccine to freeze? And again, using that 50% cutoff. And if we looked at farm 4, where the majority of that time was frozen, any time that farmer put a vaccine and put it into that fridge, potentially that vaccine could have been frozen. So I think we just need to recognise, especially from this study, that there was real concerns with how the fridges performed on temperature. 14 of the fridges actually had an event where the temperature rose above 8 degrees centigrade, and 7 of the fridges had an event, a freezing event, where the temperature was taken down below naught and actually maintained there. So we certainly need to work with farmers to help improve storage on farm. Ideally, we probably want to reduce the amount of time that vaccines are stored on farm. But certainly if farmers do want to do this, we need to make them aware of a correct storage methodology. And lastly, we do have technology available to us to monitor fridge performance, and perhaps it would be better to use that. And that there is just a picture of a data logger where the probe goes into the glycol, and that will actually can be set up to send you a wireless alert, an email alert, if that fridge should just go out of temperature. So I'd just like to obviously thank my co-authors, my co-author Gus from University of Bristol for helping look at the data, and the participating practices, which is the Shepton Vet Group, Synergy Farm Health, and Torch Farm and Equine, and for their farmers for allowing me to place these loggers in their fridges. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. From my vantage point, I could see a lot of guilty faces when those images of the fridges were put up on the screen. Paul and I know who you are, so you know what you have to do when you go home, otherwise we'll be paying you a visit. So if you need any questions on how to manage it, then now's the time.
This big importance of these results, but my question is very simple. It should be not forbidden to keep the vaccines out of the hands of veterinarian. It is simple aid to solve this problem. Yes.
I think it should out of the hands of the veterinarian, which would probably not be...
in Poland, at least, it is forbidden to give the vaccine out of the property of the veterinarian, which should vaccinate the animals.
No, I certainly agree that if we can reduce the time that vaccine spends on farm, then hopefully we're going to reduce this happening. But I think we have to accept that in some countries that is allowed. Certainly in the UK, some farmers have to travel quite a distance to their practices to collect the vaccine. So, where that is allowed, we just need to make sure that they're going to be stored as appropriately, and making sure that the actual farmer is aware of the need to store the vaccines correctly. I think sometimes that part tends to be forgotten.
Do you agree that this is one of the reasons of failing of vaccination programs? And with the conclusion that if you you start a vaccination program, you should always combine it with monitoring of the disease.
I don't think there's not a lot of work in animal health on the sort of impact of poor storage and subsequent vaccine efficacy. I think it is well recognised in human health that it has an impact on vaccine efficacy, so there'd be no reason to suggest it would be any different in animal health.
But I mean, many times you hear people conclude that the vaccine is not efficient, but sometimes it's the wrong use of the vaccine that is the cause of the failing of the vaccination program.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think we know what incorrect storage or failure to store vaccines correctly and how that could contribute to the outcome of vaccine protocols. And I do think, but clearly there's many other things, there's many other factors as well that can impact.
Hi. Did you consider linking recording disease events on those farms with potentially where these vaccines may or may not have been used on each of those farms, and linking those back to essentially to the last gentleman's point and seeing where the vaccines were actually failing, and the farmers weren't aware of it?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. When we set out to do this study, what we didn't want it to come across as a farm audit. So we were very careful not to try and make any associations between what was happening on farm. It was really just an observational study to see what might be happening in farm fridges. But it would be a lovely thing to do.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think we'll push on to our last speaker now. I'd like to welcome